balance of what's happening internally, that sense of what's going on, and it flows. This is not fixated on one or the other. It's flowing, it's flowing. Sometimes it's hard to regulate. Sometimes we get fixated on what's happening in our situation, the outside. How many of us get like pulled into the day-to-day busyness of life, or we get fixated on something very internal. Think about somebody that just heard very distressing news, right? Their focus is very inward. How many of you have ever experienced when someone says, hey, are you with us? What's happening? And you're like, oh, I was lost in my thoughts. So there's that flow between what's going on outside, what's going on inside. So the other way of looking at self-awareness is a continuum, that sometimes we are highly attuned. We're sensing our environment, we're sensing what's going on inside, we're in this full contact of awareness. I like to think of this as when people focus on sometimes meditation, or they start looking at yoga, where they're just really in touch with themselves and what's going on in the moment. This is that brightness, right? Moment by moment experiences. Now, there's some activities on the other end of the spectrum, they don't really require heightened awareness. So think about sleep. Do we really need to know what's going on inward and outward when it comes to sleep? So we live in this continuum, and it's unrealistic to think that we could stay at any place, right? We can't stay in this high awareness all the time. And Gestalt is not really about that. We're not about being in this high awareness at every second of the day. This is not a good or bad. There's not values attached to this. It's understanding and expanding. So we want to make your continuum bigger so that you can go more and more and more into having these moments where you're very attuned, you're very connected, right? So one thing that we always also like to appreciate is the balance that comes with this, right? How many of you can appreciate summer and appreciate the warmth because you've experienced winter? So one cannot exist without the other. Now, we have a lot of creative adjustments about how we live our life that we go throughout this spectrum. And if you go back to the other slide, read about the balance, we go outward and inward. Let me give you an example. When I had my son, I did not cut my hair or dye it or even think about hair for a year. I had to make creative adjustments, which means all of my focus became very much on this brand new human being that I was in charge of. And I had to shift all of my focus really on him in that time span of my life. I mean, I forgot I had hair. I remember going to a clinical training and my student says, oh, that look is very in where the end of your hair looks lighter than the top of your hair. I said, that's not on purpose. That's because I let my hair grow out because I forgot I had it. There's nothing wrong with that, right? This balance, this flow is a part of who we are. And in Gestalt therapy, we really appreciate that. The problem exists when we don't creatively adjust back, or we don't creatively adjust when our situation changes. So let's say that my child went off to college and I still forgot that I had hair or anything going on with who I am, right? There's not that flow. So we love to kind of look at this idea of creative adjustments. This is also linked to unfinished business. So unfinished business basically means that we have places that we haven't formed a response and moved on from. In some way we got stuck. So we like to look at this as understanding that we as humans, we have the need to complete the uncompleted. We have to have meaningful wholes of our experience. This is where some people remember the word closure. We use it in society all the time. Well, we didn't have enough closure from that experience. That's where this concept comes from. When we don't have it, we seek it. And this is a sense of how we make sense of our entire world, right? Interesting, our life is filled with this premise. So think about your to-do list for today. Think about your weekend plans. Do you need to do some housekeeping? do you think about doing laundry? We move from one task to another once it's completed. Now let's turn the concept inward. Think about grieving. We go through what we call a process of grieving, and we hope to eventually move towards a sense of acceptance and closure about a loss. Now, it's not possible and sometimes not appropriate to achieve a sense of completeness, but we as humans, we have a drive for it. And when we fail to find a sense of solution, what ends up happening is we get stuck. We get stuck in those little unfinished pieces of our life. This, unfortunately, turned into a lot of internal clutter. It takes up a lot of psychological space. So this clutter ends up finding ways to express itself. It might be from psychological expression. So think of anxiety, OCD, PTSD, insomnia. It could be expressed in our physical self. When we feel tension in our body, we feel kind of revved up. It could also be expressed in the way that we connect to others, like relationships. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you had a partner that cheated, and you move on to the next partner after a certain amount of time, but there's still that worry. You worry that they're going to cheat. You spend time looking to see that they're not. You maybe hover a little more than you would because there wasn't a sense of resolution from that unfinished business from before. So it gets carried into it. Okay. So as we move into our new sense of normal, right? Adjusting, and I'm going to use the pandemic as our focus here. What is the unfinished business for you? When we go through if you think about really the last 6 months, there may be a sense of grief and loss, grief or loss over even a role, maybe your role in your job going into an office, a space that was yours. Maybe it's a sense of freedom. For many, we ended up getting flooded with so many things that we essentially lost that freedom, that flexibility. For many, it also might be a grief and loss of an actual person that may have passed because of the virus. You may also be experiencing some fear, worried about what's happening now, feeling a sense of heightened concern. Again, these are all possibilities when we talk about unfinished business that we need to take time to explore so that it doesn't end up being internal clutter. So let's start a conversation here. Think about self-care, okay? Think about how your environment has changed. Are you now at home as where you used to be in an office? Where's your awareness? Is your awareness getting stuck inward, feeling worried, having anxiety? Is your awareness getting stuck outward? So many things, children at home, lots of work that needs to be done, or now focusing on your house because you're home more. We're hearing so much that people are doing upgrades to their house and projects. The other thing is, are you purposefully dulling your awareness to cope? Because if your environment has changed and you don't have the coping strategies you had before, are you finding ways to dull your sense of awareness so that you're not aware of how possibly unhappy you are or stressed you are? We've seen a significant spike in suicides and addiction over the last 6 months compared to a normal year. So are these starting to become shifted or different? When I say start a conversation, we like to turn your dialogue into the solution, meaning when you start talking to parts of yourself that can give you either wisdom or guidance, or maybe say what needs to be said, or maybe just needs a voice. Maybe you've turned off looking inward for so long that at this point it feels hard to go through a day-to-day without focusing solely on the outside world. What's going on in the house, getting rushed up with your to-do list or what's happening. So I ask you to start a dialogue, and this is in Gestalt fashion, with a part of yourself that may help you to increase your awareness. So which one of these do you need to talk to? Do you need to talk to your future self? Some reassurance that something is going to be better in the future? Or maybe you're accepting self. Yes, accepting self would be accepting that we all need a little grace right now. Perhaps we need some compassion. Accepting that this is a season, right? So allowing that sense of dialogue to turn inward with parts of who you are can give you some resolution to the unfinished business that's happening from the pandemic. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. And once again, just a reminder, any questions, please enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So, Dr. Stewart Spencer, you were talking a lot about unfinished business. Can you give us some, let's say, tips for how to recognize really if we have unfinished business, or indicators that there are some things that we need to address?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we see as a big, red flag that this is something we need to work on is when a pattern is continued over and over and over. What do I mean by that? Clients that come in that had a very absentee father and didn't offer any attention or guidance or that parental masculinity that we see in the dyad. If they didn't have this and they really wanted it, seeking it, needing it, and so they tend to look for it in their partners. So instead of finding a partner that meets who they are right now, there's a sense of stuck where they continue looking for someone to fill this role and fill this role. These patterns that we see, sometimes life themes, can be really strong indicators of unfinished business.
Okay, thank you. So another question here is, are there elements of, Are there elements of Gestalt therapy that you're not a fan of?
That's a good question. It's such a robust theory. I mean, compared to the others, it always feels almost overly complicated. There's so many pieces of it. I can't say there's something that I don't really like about it. I tend to lean more towards Laura Pearl's. I tend to lean more towards her part of the theory. She really extended it out. And when she extended it out, she extended into the relational aspects. So that's the piece that I really love, which is understanding that our connection is what's going to bring forth what needs to happen in therapy.
Mm-hmm. And another question is, would you use this approach to treat trauma or PTSD?
Absolutely, 100%. So actually, when we teach trauma treatment, we talk about parts therapy, which came from Gestalt. And so when we talk about, even to explain sometimes to clients, if clients are really struggling with their sense of hyperarousal, we talk about how, think about a family living inside of a house, and the family decided they're going to toss one of them out because they did something wrong. Now that part who belongs in that house comes back and bangs on the door, but everybody tries to ignore it. And that's essentially what trauma that's when the symptoms of trauma happens. When we get the flashing, flooding thoughts, the feeling of sensation that comes back into the client's life, and this intrusiveness that comes from trauma symptoms. And so what we do is we work to accept this part into the house, that this is the part that trauma happened to. And we don't cut parts out. We learn to embrace them and accept them and realize that each one has its own value. And that's actually how we move towards what we call post-traumatic growth. So we use a lot of the pieces of Gestalt in trauma treatment.
Okay, so after you've tried to be aware of something, the question is, how do you keep that awareness?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. So we like to consider things almost as if it's an experiment, right? So we experiment in our therapy, meaning when you have this new awareness, well, what do you want to do with it? You know, how do you want to contact the world differently? If the balance is between this inner self and what's happening in the world, well, if your inner self changes a little bit, how would you like to now contact and interact with the world? And how will you receive the feedback that the world contacts and interacts with you? And so it's essentially experimenting to find what fits for you, because we're not experts on who you are. That's your role as the client, as each individual is an expert on who they are. So this ask the expert. If it was on you, we'd be asking you about you, right? So we ask you to figure out what's that new contact, right? And then when you receive kind of how that works, that new style, then making a decision if you want to keep it or let it go. So it's almost essentially awareness, and keeping awareness is constantly trying out how you're going to integrate that awareness into your daily life.
Okay, thank you. So someone here made reference to the last slide, and they're asking if you were to talk to all of the selves identified, which one would you start with first?
So I don't, as if it was me in the therapist chair, I wouldn't have selected it. I would have asked my client to select it. We are very willing to give up the power in the relationship because it's not about us, it's about them. So I would ask you, what part felt like it needed to say something? What part felt like it didn't have a voice and needed to be heard? Or has been talking, but the volume's been turned down on it. It's been muted because we didn't want to hear that right now, right? So for me, and so now I'll do some application. For me, it would be the accepting self. Accepting that right now in our new normal, it's a little harder to get through the massive amount of things I normally would, because before there was a lot more support and community. And so now, with how much social distancing is going on, how many restrictions are going on, that there needs to be a little bit more acceptance and compassion around how much can really be completed in our new normal, if that helps.
Yes, and there's a comment here saying that your information is helping. The comment says that you've talked about things that the person had in mind. Thank you so much. And you are very motivating, and you're speaking inner truth.
Oh, thanks for that comment.
So this, I'm guessing, is from one of our counselors. The question is how to help clients to accept their new COVID reality.
Oh, that's a great question. So I used to have a mentor, and she said, if a client keeps talking about it, then it still bothers them, and you haven't gotten to the meat of what it is. So if they still need to process it through the dialogue to find the resolution, then I would honestly, to reach acceptance, I would allow them to continue dialoguing it. You know, the interesting thing about reaching a sense of awareness and acceptance also often is a sense of time and processing. And some of us are very quick processors, right? And then others of us, I'm a reverse processor. I need to go through in a situation and then reverse back and process all the way through it again to really receive something out of that. And so clients can be like that too. In order to help them accept, I would say, let them keep talking about it. Let them process it at their own pace, that we need to kind of meet them where they are instead of rushing them to meet where we are.
Mm-hmm. So continuing with the impact of the pandemic, this question is asking about how to, when speaking to yourself in the different areas, like on that last slide. How do you speak to your future self and assure yourself that things are going to work out even when we're not sure how at this point?
Yeah. So oftentimes when I present on the technique, the empty chair, which comes from Gestalt, that's usually what people know about Gestalt. They're like, oh, I love that theory. I love the empty chair. And I'm like, it's way more than one technique. It's huge. So usually when I demonstrate this and I explain what it is and talk about the technique, we do an example of visualization, individual visualization. So what I ask you to do in order to really connect with a future self and to think about that is to set the scene, right? And you can try this on your own at home. Set a chair in front of you. Take a deep breath, close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and imagine yourself in a specific time frame, whether that's next year, whether that's the beginning of the year, whatever it is. And then visualize what you will look like, how you'll sit in the chair. Maybe the nature of your tone. Will it be upbeat? Will it be calm? Think about maybe what time of year it is. Will you have a tan because it's summer? So visualize that future self. And then I would encourage you to talk to it first. What do you need to know? What is it that you hope that they can tell you? This is about dialoguing with yourself. There's a lot of wisdom inside. You know, this is a piece that I think that a lot of therapists miss because they get really focused on, let me give you some suggestions or let me give you, some resources. But the reality is we have a lot of wisdom in our own self that we just need to kind of uncover. Gestalt is about acknowledging what is known, right? That there is some wisdom in there and we're just uncovering it so that it can be known. So then get up and switch to the future self. What would it say? Do you have a sense of everything's going to be fine? When you move into that chair, does it feel like, hey, stop worrying, this is the season? Or does it feel scary? Does it feel like, hey, it didn't get much better? So there's that right there is awareness of, do you have a sense of worriedness that's carrying with you into the future, that there's not even hope, right? So some of this is about diving in to get a feel for what you're holding.
Okay. And do you see Gestalt therapy as complementary to mindfulness?
Yes, absolutely. So mindfulness, most of the time we think of that coming from the CBT world, which is it's a little bit underneath that umbrella, right? But yeah, it does. It is very aligned. The idea of being aware, mindfulness, and this might be a little bit of a difference here, is that Gestalt really doesn't put a value on these things. So it's not good or bad. It is what it is. That's kind of where we settle. So, if you are in a heightened place of awareness, great. If you're not, let's just kind of open that up as well, right? Whereas mindfulness, there's a really specific goal, and it's to be mindful. So there's a little bit of a difference in value system there.
Okay, so we have a few questions where students are really interested in Gestalt therapy. So they're asking if there are any programs that you would recommend for training or any books that they should read.
So I'll offer a book. One of the best places that I tell students to start is Dave Mann, M-A-N-N. It's a green and yellow book, and it's called 100 Key Techniques and Interventions, or 100 Key Points and Techniques from Gestalt. And it's a great starter kit. Training wise, there's a couple in the States that I'm familiar with, but I know because of the pandemic, they stopped for a while. So I wouldn't really offer those just yet. But the reading material, definitely start with Dave Mann's book. He gives a lot of great information, very concise, easier to consume.
Okay, and so I'll end here with a comment. It says, thank you very much I love listening to you. You always give me a sense of confidence and wisdom. So I think that's an excellent way to end. And I echo that. Thank you very much, Dr. Stewart Spencer, for being with us today and for sharing all of this very wonderful information.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for stopping by.
And thank you all for participating, for asking your questions, for joining us today. And next week, of course, at the same time here, we'll have another session where we'll be talking about suicide, specifically ending stigma and enhancing support. So you don't want to miss that. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the week.